Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Now we'll discuss a module on translations by Indian into English. This is from the paper Literary Translation in India. The content of this module is written by Shashwati Shaha, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Sikkim University. The process of translation is not new in India. The practice of anuvad or rupantar is as old as the civilization itself. Translations from one Indian language to another continued for centuries before the advent of the British colonizers. But with the advent of the British in India, there began as if a translation industry which translated Indian text into English and vice versa. Therefore, there began a tradition of translation in India where Indian languages, instead of culturally interacting between themselves, were interacting with English through the process of translation. The importance attached to English as the language of the colonizer became disproportionate when compared to any other Indian languages. There are many tangible and intangible determinants at work that led to the privileged position of English translation, which will be dealt with in this module. According to Rita Kothari, a historical perspective of Indian translation activity in general requires consideration in terms of three stages: oral, written, and printed. There is, of course, no mechanism for tracing the oral tradition of translation. The written tradition, on the other hand, is rooted in medieval India. Around the 14th and 15th century, it was the time when Sanskrit scriptures began to travel into the regional languages. Ramayana and Mahabharata were adapted in different languages and became of a part of the lives of common men. The journey made from the exalted Sanskrit scriptures to the more humble regional languages can be seen as a spiritual revolution made possible through translation. Scriptures that were written in Sanskrit were made accessible to the underprivileged lower classes. It was an attempt to release scriptures from the monopolist custody of Sanskrit Pandits and move towards secularization and vernacularism. At this point of time, Sanskrit enjoyed an elitist and central position compared to other Indian languages. Although it was a language of the soil, translating from Sanskrit into regional languages was both a matter of deference and courage. Therefore, these translations in vernaculars were hardly passive cultural creations, and they gradually produced an alternative literature which told the same stories with subtle emphasis to alternative audiences. If we would like to trace back the history of Indian translation in English, we have to see the colonial perspective or the history of coming of British and Orientalist phase. This medieval translation was modified and more systematized with the coming of the British. The English language came to Indian with the British in the 18th century and gave clear signs of waiting to stay on. On a way in which English preserved itself in the Indian literary culture is through translation. English emerged as the most desirable choice as target language, and the body of English translation in India is privileged over translations into other Indian languages. Translations from Indian languages into English are products of the special context of late 18th and 19th century British India. But this process of translation was initiated in the early stages of British rule in India, which can be called the Orientalist phase. The Orientalists associated translation with the construction of knowledge about the people and culture they were ruling. This they thought would facilitate their system of administration. As Kothari pointed out, the Orient was translated and made available for self-definition not only to the Europeans but also to the Orientals themselves. As such, travel writings, histories, and other dictionaries may also be seen as acts of translation. Acts of translation, acts of interpreting local systems of signification and translating them into one's own understanding of a dominant culture. It was through these translations that the British administrators wanted to study the Hindu psyche. The Pandits, who are the preserver of knowledge in India, could not be trusted upon, as a total ignorance about the Indian language and culture on the part of the administrator can make them vulnerable. Thus, they began with the translation of the ancient text, as it helped unveil the mystic around ancient Indian civilization, because idioms got desacralized by the very act of translation. Moreover, Warren Hastings believed that natives had to be ruled by their own principles and institutions. William Jones, who arrived in Calcutta in 1783, took up the project of translation that would serve to domesticate the Orient and thereby turn it into province of European learning. Translations were also important for Jones because the apparent monopoly of a form of indigenous knowledge by certain classes could only be broken through translation. The period saw the translation of a legal text or Vivadharanav Setu as a code of Gentoo laws or ordinations of the Pandits in 1776, by Nathaniel Halhead's Charles Wilkins' translation Gita as the Bhagavad Gita in 1784. William Jones translated Manusmriti as the Institute of Hindu Law or the Ordinances of Manu. These translations were done at the government's behest for facilitating administration. There were also translations done outside the purview of the government, like Jones' translation of Avigyan Shakuntalam and as Sakuntala or the Fatal Ring in 1789. The beginning of the 19th century and the Indian intervention in the sphere of translation of Indian knowledge and literary text into English. The Orientalist phase declined in the 19th century with the rise of the Anglicized, who were in favor of introducing English education in India. According to the Anglicist, coming in of the knowledge of the West to India will mark the extension of their commerce. They thought English education would awaken invention among the Indians. They would initiate improvements at home as well as acquire a relish for the indigenous manufacture of Europe. The Macaulay's Minute of 1835 gradually changed the entire scenario, and India was no more regarded as a place which can be studied, rather became the ruin of a decadent civilization. Thus, translation from Indian languages, mainly Sanskrit, into English declined. But English was in no way an imposition on the Indians. They happily embraced this change in their education system and became a part of it. They now became an active participant in the process of knowledge making, of the government. The Indian intellectuals were already aware of the practice of anuvad prevalent in India, and they also acquired the skills of translation brought by the British. Translation practices of the indigenous intellectuals created a separate space where the vernacular cultural production thrived in a relative autonomy from the colonial state and aimed at producing results that undercut the colonial motives. The Indian intellectuals began to intervene and interrupt the colonizers' version of India. Indians reacted, responded, and redefined, and the fulcrum of contestation was once again India's historic past. Given the colonial expropriation of India's past, a retrieval of history became an important aspect of the anti-colonial agenda. Translation became a tool to carry out this agenda and issue correction in the Westerners' version of India's past. The first English translation by an Indian was the translation of Shankar's Vedanta in 1816 by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Roy was the first Indian intellectual to realize the economic and cultural benefits of the English language and insisted that Indians should actually take up English education. He also translated the Kena and Isha Upanishads in the same year, to correct populist misconceptions about India. In the preface he writes, "The present is an endeavor to render an abridgment of the work into English, by which I expect to prove to my European friends that the superstitious practices which deform the Hindu religion have nothing to do with the pure spirit of its dictates." Thus, his translations were reformist and had theological and political implications. This could be inferred from the title of his translation of Vedanta, "Establishing the Unity of the Supreme Being," and that he alone is the object of propitiation and worship. This could be seen as an attempt made by an Indian to historicize Indian himself instead of accepting the version created and circulated by the British. But such as a step was not easy because it entails complete knowledge of the East and the West, both cultural and linguistics, and Roy was very well versed in the tradition and language of both East and the West. This position, as Kothari points out, gave his translations a standing and seriousness made possible for the first time, and in the process rendered the issue of the fidelity of the translation peripheral. His English translations were all received in the West, and he became the representative of a new generation of Indian scholars who could intervene in the British description of their land. The second half of the 19th century. The tradition started by Roy gained momentum only in the second half of the 19th century. Translations from Sanskrit in the hands of the Indians were important move. This became a necessity to combat the denigration that Indian knowledge system was subjected to by the British. The people of the East were regarded as backward by the Western nation in terms of certain standards set by them, which defined modernity and progress. The knowledge of the backwardness is never very comforting, and therefore the nationalism of these countries is marked by the effort to re-equip the nation culturally. The practice of translating from Sanskrit into Bengali was an attempt of bringing our own glorious tradition to those ignorant people who have no access to Sanskrit. According to Devi, this period produced dedicated specialists as well as inspired visionaries, and the translation carried out was either philologically accurate, to the last detail as in innumerous text on poetics, or was cheerfully liberal as in the renderings by occultists, godmen, and social radicals. Some noted translations made by Indian intellectuals during this period includes Vidyasagar's essay on marriage of Hindu widows in 1856, where he plays the role of a social reformer. He tried to reinterpret the religious life of the Hindu across distance of time, practice or community. Another noted translation of the period is Michael Madhusudan Datta's translation of Shormishtha, a drama in 5 acts in English in the year 1859. R.C. Dutt, who was also a member of the Indian Civil Services in British India, translated Indian epics Ramayana and the Mahabharata. He considered the epics to be national property. His other work, Lays of Ancient India, included translations of Rig Veda, the Upanishads, Kalidasa and Vairavi. Dutt states, ancient India, like ancient Greece, boasts of 2 great epics. The Mahabharata, based on the legends and tradition of a great historical war, is the Iliad of India. The Ramayana, describing the wanderings and adventures of a prince banished from his country, has so far something in common with the Odyssey. Dutt's translations, therefore, is an attempt of establishing the glory of India's cultural heritage and to show how India too has got a literary tradition which can rank alongside the Greek epics. There is therefore a constant consciousness among the Indian intellectuals to glorify the rich past that the country had. This was important not only to nullify Macaulay's claim that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India, but to create a historical background that will ultimately lead to the formation of a modern nation state. The translation of Dinabandhu Mitra's Nil Darpan marks a significant point in the history of translation in India. It was one of the first texts to be translated that dealt with social issues and was not a religious text. The play was written in Bengali in the year 1860, and within 7 months it was translated into English. The play was about the fate of the poor Indian farmers and their exploitation at the hand of the white indigo planters. It addressed issues of racial exploitation by the British. The English translation created huge furor, and it was after the publication of the translation there was marked deterioration in the Indo-British relationship and changed the British attitude towards the vernacular literature. The translation led to the famous trial of Reverend James Long, who was sentenced to imprisonment for publishing Nil Darpan. The name of the translator was, however, never revealed. All the English editions state translated by a native. Although it is widely believed that Michael Madhusudan Dutt was the translator, it could not be established with certainty. Now let us talk about turn of the century. Aurobindo was a philosopher, translator who made some remarkable translations from Sanskrit and Bengali into English. He translated parts of Ramayana, Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita and selections of Kalidasa from Sanskrit. He began translating Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Bengali novel Anandamath into English but could not complete the task. He also translated the Kural in parts from Tamil. Aurobindo not just translated but also attempted to develop a theory of translation, though the several essays that he wrote, like on translating Kalidasa, on translating the Bhagavad Gita, on translating the Upanishads, freedom in translation, importance of turn of language in translation, translation of prose into poetry, and remarks on Bengali translations. being inspired by the cognitive philosophy of ancient India. Aurobindo stated that translation is a process that involves multiple steps. The translator has to first read, analyze, and interpret the text to be translated. Thus, translation, according to him, is a cognitive process. He further says that the human consciousness that operates behind this cognitive process has three levels: nama or name, rupa or form of meaning, and swarupa or essential figure of truth. The text has to grasp at the level of swarupa before it can be translated at the other two levels of nama and rupa. Another major translation undertaken by an Indian into English is the auto-translation of Gitanjali by Rabindranath Tagore in 1912. The importance of this translation lies not only in the fact that Tagore received the Nobel Prize for it in the year 1913, but also in the impact the translation created upon the West. This was a unique case of the author being the translator himself and therefore free from the anxiety of fidelity. Tagore explained that I simply felt an urge to recapture through the medium of another language the feeling and sentiments which had created such a feast of joy within me in past days, and that I was making fresh acquaintance with my own heart by dressing it in other clothes. The translation created an image of a spiritual and mystical East in front of a turbulent Europe dealing with the political turmoils preceding the First World War. The response to Gitanjali was unequivocal and overwhelming and gave Tagore the status of the Messiah from the East who can deal with the turmoils and unhappiness. But this image of Tagore did not match with the real image he had in Bengali as a consequential Bengali writer of the century. The author of poems, plays, short stories, songs, memoirs, and essays of enduring popularity and importance. Now let us conclude our discussion. The translations during this period, therefore, can be looked at as Kapil Kapoor remarks, I quote, larger process of resistance to the alien domination, an expression of identity, a reassertion of the native self, unquote. Yet there can be a gradual movement from the religious text to the translating of contemporary Indian works. What is important to be noticed is that translation in India did not remain an administrative tool of the British rulers, but was taken up by the Indian intellectuals as a tool to create their own self-identity. Now, let us summarize whole discussion. In this module, we have discussed how translation is age-old practice in India. We have mentioned that there is a long tradition of translation practice in India as long as the Indian civilization is. But there is very less discussion on the theory of translation. We have discussed that how the translation of Indian literatures and Indian philosophy into English had been started with the British advent in India, with the colonization and with the Orientalist purpose. We have also discussed why Sanskrit texts were so significant, so important for the British rulers, for the Orientalist scholars and British intellectuals. We came to know that text like Manusmriti was translated to rule the native in better way. We came to know that Avigyan Shakuntalam and many other Sanskrit texts were translated by the British to know the mystery of the land, the mystery of the ancient civilization, and to establish a model, a instruction of translation for the Indians. In this model, we have also discussed that through the emergence of anglicized section among the natives, the translation of Sanskrit literature into English actually declined, and the translators from the Indians as a class had been emerged. We have talked about the famous poets and translators like Tagore, like Aurobindo, and their understanding of translation, their practice of translation. So, through this module, we have actually tried to trace back the history of translation of Indian literature, philosophy, and the text of spirituality into English. Thank you.